The morning Lena Harwick won the farm, she was wearing her dead husband's jacket. It wasn't a conscious choice. She'd reached into the closet in the dark the way she'd done every morning for the past 3 years, and her fingers had found the worn canvas of Roy's old field coat before they found anything of her own. She'd put it on without thinking, didn't notice until she was already in her car, backing down the driveway, and caught a trace of something motor oil and cedar that still lived in the fabric despite 3 years of washing and time and trying. She noticed. She kept driving. That was September in Millhaven, Iowa. The kind of September that still pretended to be summer during the day, but turned cold the moment the sun dropped below the tree line, reminding you that something was ending, whether you were ready or not. The county fair had been running for 91 years in the field behind Millhaven High School, and it would run for 91 more with or without anyone who'd attended the first one. That was the thing about small towns. They kept going. The people changed. The institutions didn't. Lena parked at the far end of the gravel lot, which was habit now. Roy had always parked far out, said the walk was good for them, said most people were too lazy to go that distance, and it meant fewer door dings. Roy had opinions about parking lots. Roy had opinions about most things. She missed that more than she'd expected, not the opinions themselves, but the constancy of them. The way you could predict what a person would say before they said it, and how that predictability, which you'd once found maddening, became the thing you'd give anything to have back. She walked across the gravel alone. The fair was already alive when she arrived. The smell reached her first fried dough and popcorn, and the particular sweetness of carnival food that existed nowhere else, designed to be irresistible precisely because you only encountered it once a year. Children ran between the rides with the total commitment of people who had nowhere more important to be. Families clustered around the 4-H displays. Old men in feed store caps stood in circles discussing the price of corn with the solemnity of people discussing war. Lena wandered. She'd come because the alternative was the apartment that was technically still hers for 27 more days until the lease expired and she had to be somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't figured out yet. She'd come because standing still felt dangerous right now. Like if she stopped moving, she might finally have to reckon with the full arithmetic of her situation, and she wasn't ready for that. 22 years. That was how long she'd worked as a senior accountant at Kenworth Industrial Supply. 22 years of quarterly reports and tax filings and balance sheets that balanced because she made them balance, because she was careful and precise and thorough in ways that the company had depended on without ever fully appreciating. Then Kenworth got acquired by a larger firm out of Chicago, and the larger firm did what larger firms do. They consolidated, they streamlined, they eliminated redundancies, which was the word they used. Redundancies. As if the people who'd spent decades doing careful work were simply duplications of something that already existed somewhere else. 38 applications in 6 months. 38 careful cover letters explaining her experience, her reliability, her attention to detail. 38 responses that ranged from polite rejections to complete silence. The rejections at least had the decency to acknowledge she existed. She was 55 years old. In the accounting world, that translated to too experienced for entry level, too expensive for mid-level, and quietly, carefully, never officially too old for anything they actually wanted to fill. Roy would have been furious on her behalf. He would have sat at the kitchen table with his jaw set and said something direct and probably slightly profane about what these companies could do with their redundancies. She would have told him to lower his voice because the neighbors could hear. He would have said he didn't care. They would have argued briefly and then laughed, and the laughing would have made everything slightly more bearable. But Roy was 3 years gone. Heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon in March at 61 years old, which was precisely the age at which you believed you still had plenty of time for everything you hadn't gotten to yet. She'd been at work when it happened, balancing a quarterly report. She wandered past the craft booths, past the pie judging table, where a woman in a denim apron was explaining the criteria for crust flakiness with the intensity of a Supreme Court argument. She wandered past the small livestock pens where 4-H kids stood beside their animals with the particular combination of pride and terror that comes from having worked very hard on something and now being asked to be judged for it. She recognized that feeling. She was near the parking lot thinking about leaving when she saw the booth. The Millhaven Volunteer Fire Department had been running the fair raffle for 20 years. Hank Pruitt was behind the table this year. Hank, who'd worked with Roy at the grain cooperative for a decade before Roy passed Hank, with his gray mustache and his permanent half-smile, and his habit of calling everyone friend, regardless of whether that was accurate. Lena Harwick, he said, lighting up the way people light up when they're genuinely happy to see you, which was rarer than it should have been. I was hoping you'd come by. She stopped. It would have been rude not to. $1 a ticket, 5 for 5, Hank said, gesturing at the prize board behind him. Got some good ones this year. The auto shop donated an oil change package. Betty Marsh put up one of her quilts. He paused. And the county's offering the old Voss place out on rural Route 9. Lena looked at the prize board. The farm was listed as the grand prize, which would have seemed generous if you didn't know anything about it. Edmund Voss had died 5 years ago, 2020, during the strange lockdown spring when the whole country was trying to figure out what was happening and grief had nowhere to go. He'd lived alone on that farm for decades, no family that anyone knew of, and when he died, the property had passed to the county for back taxes and general abandonment. She'd driven past it once, maybe twice in the years since. 40 acres of Iowa farmland that looked like it had given up on itself. The house listing, the barn sagging, the fields gone to ragweed and volunteer corn that nobody had planted and nobody wanted. The kind of place where you looked and thought something happened here that nobody ever finished. $5, Lena heard herself say. She pulled the bill from her wallet before she'd made a conscious decision to do it. One of the last before her unemployment deposit went through. Hank handed her 5 tickets with numbers printed in faded blue ink and looked at her with the careful warmth of someone who understood more about her situation than either of them would acknowledge directly. Good luck, Lena, he said. She pocketed the tickets and walked away. She'd planned to leave before the drawing. That was the truth of it. She'd told herself she'd walk the fairgrounds for another hour and then drive home while there was still light, make something simple for dinner, spend the evening updating her resume for the 39th time, in hopes that some new phrasing of the same experience would produce a different result. But the fair had its own gravity. She found herself at a bench near the edge of the grounds as the sun began its deliberate descent toward the tree line, watching a family pack up their van, a father lifting a sleeping child over his shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 100 times, a mother gathering blankets, 2 older kids dragging a stuffed animal that had been won at some booth and was already being dragged with the casualness of something already taken for granted. A complete and ordinary thing. She watched it the way you watch something ordinary when you've lost your own ordinary and haven't found a replacement yet. The announcement came over the fair's PA system at 6 o'clock, right on schedule, right after the pie competition results, and right before the fireworks that the town had been doing at this same time in this same place for longer than anyone currently attending could remember. And the grand prize winner is ticket number 7741, Lena Harwick. She checked her tickets with hands that had gone slightly clumsy. The last one matched. The walk to the main tent was longer than it should have been, or maybe it just felt that way because she was aware of being watched. Jerry Kowalski, no relation to anyone, ran the feed store and the fair announcements with equal enthusiasm, and he held up a manila envelope as she approached the stage and grinned at her with the theatrical warmth of a man who loved a moment. Lena Harwick, come on up here. There was applause. Real applause, generous in the way that fair applause tended to be. But underneath it, she heard something else. Not everyone was unkind about it. Most people weren't really. But small towns carry their information the way rivers carry sediment. Everything's suspended in the current, and everyone in that tent knew what the Voss place was worth, which was to say, very little. In dollars. She heard it in the spaces between the clapping. A laugh that came and went. A comment she caught only in pieces. Wonder what she's going to do with, and then the wind took the rest. Someone near the back said something she didn't quite hear, but understood the shape of from the laughter that followed. Jerry shook her hand with theatrical enthusiasm. Congratulations! You are now the proud owner of the old Voss farm. 40 acres house barn, the whole works. He handed her the manila envelope. Inside, she could feel the weight of a deed, a set of keys, and something else she didn't examine until later. She thanked him. She walked off the stage. She moved through the crowd with the careful steadiness of someone who has decided that whatever they're feeling will wait until they're alone, which was a skill she'd developed over the past 3 years and had become quite good at. She caught fragments on the way out. That place is a wreck. Roofs probably caved in. Voss was always strange. She didn't stop. She found her car at the far end of the lot exactly where she'd left it with no door dings, because Roy had been right about that as about other things. She sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine. The fireworks started above the fairgrounds, painting the sky in colors that felt like they belonged to someone else's celebration, and she sat in the dark and held the envelope in her lap and tried to figure out what she was feeling. It wasn't disappointment. She hadn't expected anything. It wasn't quite hope either. She was 55 years old and unemployed and 27 days from needing to be somewhere she hadn't identified yet, and hope felt like an extravagance she couldn't currently afford. It was something closer to a question. The kind that doesn't come with language attached, just a feeling that something has shifted slightly the way the air changes before weather arrives. She started the car and drove home through the dark. She called Colt that night. Her son answered on the third ring, which was better than usual. He was 32 years old and lived in Boston and worked for a software company that she understood in only the most general terms. Something about systems architecture, something about infrastructure words that she nodded at appropriately. He was good at what he did. She knew that without understanding it, the way you can tell when someone is skilled at something, even if you can't evaluate the skill itself. Roy would have been proud. Roy had always said Colt had a mind like a Swiss watch, precise, self-contained, everything where it needed to be. The Swiss watch part was accurate. Self-contained was accurate too. I won something at the fair, she said. A brief pause. Colt processed. What did you win us? A farm. Another pause longer. She could hear him recalibrating. A what? The old Voss place. Out on rural Route 9. 40 acres. A house and a barn. Mom. His voice had shifted into the register he used when he was trying to be gentle and direct at the same time, which he'd gotten from Roy. Is it worth anything? Probably not in the way you mean. In what other way would he stopped himself, started again more carefully. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to move it there, she said. My lease is up in 27 days. The silence that followed was the kind that means someone is choosing their words with great care because they're aware that the wrong ones will not help. Mom, you need to be focusing on finding work, not playing farmer. I'm not playing anything. She kept her voice even. I'll figure out the work situation. I just wanted you to know. She could hear his frustration, could picture him in his Boston apartment with its clean lines and its view of something urban and its careful order. Colt had his father's ear and his father's directness, and she was realizing more each year his father's difficulty with things he couldn't engineer toward a solution. This seems impulsive, he said. Can we talk about it properly? I could drive down this weekend. You don't need to do that. I'm fine. She meant it when she said it, which was perhaps the most honest thing about the conversation. I'll call you once I'm settled. They said goodbye, Colt still talking, Lena already thinking about what to pack. After she hung up, she opened the manila envelope on the kitchen table. The deed. The keys, 5 of them, various ages on a ring with a piece of red tape labeled in handwriting that had been careful once and shaky later. And a note about property taxes being current through the year, which someone had apparently arranged before transferring the property. There was also a photograph, black and white, printed on regular paper, clearly a copy of something older. A man in his 60s standing beside some kind of machine. He had a careful face, intelligent eyes, a slight smile that suggested he was thinking about something the camera wasn't privy to. On the back, someone had written in pencil, Voss 2018. She studied the face for a long time. This was Edmund Voss then, the man who had owned this place, the man who had died there or near there in the spring of 2020 when the world was otherwise occupied. The man who had left behind 40 acres of neglect and a raffle prize that made people laugh. She put the photograph on the kitchen table and looked at it while she ate her dinner, which was a sandwich made from whatever was in the refrigerator, eaten standing at the counter the way she'd been eating for 3 years, because sitting at the table for one had never stopped feeling like a statement she wasn't willing to make. Edmund Voss looked back at her from the photograph with that slight smile. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. She drove out to rural Route 9 the next morning. The driveway was almost invisible, a gap in the vegetation rather than a road choked with Queen Anne's lace and volunteer saplings that had spent 5 years establishing themselves in the gravel and had done a thorough job of it. They scraped against the sides of her car as she pulled through a sound like something reluctant, like the land itself was uncertain about visitors. The house appeared gradually through the overgrowth, the way something emerges when you've been looking at it wrong. Suddenly, they're obvious having been there all along. 2 stories. White paint peeling in long strips like old wallpaper, shutters hanging at angles that suggested they'd given up on the idea of function and were now purely decorative, and not well at that. The porch sagged in the middle with the particular slump of wood that has held weight for too long and is finally admitting it. The barn to the left listed slightly like a ship that had taken on water and stopped caring about horizon lines. Lena parked and got out. The silence was the first thing. Not quiet Iowa farmland in September is never quiet, full of wind and insects in the distant argument of crows. But there was something under the ambient sound that was different from other silences. A stillness that had been here long enough to become permanent. The silence of a place where nothing has been decided in years. She tested the porch steps they held, though they complained about it. She used the oldest-looking key on the ring, and after some persuasion, the front door opened. Inside, dust on everything, a uniform gray that softened the furniture into shapes like a museum of someone's life under drop cloths. A sofa with cushions compressed by years of sitting and then years of no sitting. A kitchen table with 4 chairs pushed in neatly, as if whoever had last sat there intended to come back shortly. The air had that particular smell of long closed spaces, not rot exactly, not decay, but the smell of air that has been the same air for too long, cycling through the same rooms without renewal. Lena walked through slowly, the kitchen first. Old appliances, a refrigerator from another decade, a gas stove with the kind of solid iron grates that suggested it had been bought for permanence, intended to outlast whoever purchased it. It had. A window above the sink that looked out toward the barn, the glass clouded with dust and oxidation, letting in light the color of old photographs. In the drawer nearest the sink, she found the photograph. Not a copy this time, the original. Black and white, the paper slightly curled at the edges and yellowed at the corners, the image clearer and more present than the copy that had been in the envelope. The same man, the same machine, the same slight smile. But in the original, she could see details the copy had lost: the careful arrangement of the components beside him, the way his hand rested on the machine with the particular ease of someone touching something they built themselves, something they understood completely. She turned it over. Voss 2018. The same handwriting, but in pencil, directly on the photograph, this time the letters more deliberate. She put it in the pocket of Roy's jacket and looked around the kitchen again. It needed work. Everything needed work. The windows needed replacing, the floors needed refinishing, the roof would need inspection before the first hard rain, and hard rain was coming. It always was in Iowa in October. The list of what this place required was long enough to be discouraging. But the bones were good. She didn't know where that thought came from exactly. It arrived fully formed, the way Roy used to say things that turned out to be true. Good bones, meaning the structure underneath was sound even when the surface wasn't, meaning something worth keeping was still in there. She decided, not in a dramatic way. There was no single moment of resolution, no clarity that descended like light through clouds. It was more practical than that. She had 26 days until she needed to be somewhere. She had nowhere else to be, and she was standing in a house that now legally belonged to her. The farm was hers, worthless or otherwise. She might as well find out which. She went upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, with a clawfoot tub that had probably been installed when the house was built and had outlasted everything else about the original construction. The larger bedroom had a closet with wire hangers and a shelf of folded linens that smelled of mothballs and decades. The smaller bedroom, the one she would later understand had been Edmund's workspace, was painted a faded yellow, the color of old legal pads, with a single desk pushed against the wall beneath a window that looked east toward the road. She opened the desk drawers methodically, the way she opened everything, with the careful attention of someone for whom precision was habitual, not performed. The first drawer empty, The second drawer, a stub of pencil, a dried-up rubber band, a handful of thumbtacks. The third drawer stuck. She worked it free with both hands, the wood swollen with years of Iowa humidity, and when it finally gave, it came out fast, and she had to catch it before it fell. Wedged at an angle in the back of the drawer, jammed there as if pushed in quickly, or perhaps just gradually buried by the slow accumulation of time, a journal. Leather cover brown, the hide worn soft from long handling. Not a decorative journal bought at a stationery store. A working journal. The kind a person buys for function, not appearance, and then uses until there's no more room. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen where the light was better. She made coffee in the French press she'd brought in the bag, with her laptop and her phone charger, and the 3 photographs she hadn't been willing to leave behind. She sat at the kitchen table at one of the 4 chairs, the one facing the window, and opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was precise. Each letter formed with care, the hand of someone who had taught himself to write legibly as a discipline, not a natural gift. March 15th, 1994. Started today on what might be the most important work of my life. They'll say I'm crazy. They already do. But I know this can work. The mathematics are sound. The principles are solid. What I lack in formal credentials, I make up for in stubbornness and time. Plenty of both. Lena read that paragraph 3 times, then she turned the page and kept reading. She was still at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning. The coffee was long cold. The window above the sink showed nothing but her own dim reflection against the darkness outside. A woman in a field jacket bent over a book in a stranger's kitchen, alone in a way that was starting to feel less like isolation and more like something else. Attention. The particular kind you give to something that deserves it. Edmund Voss had written about his work with the precision of a man who understood that he might be the only person who ever read these words and had decided that was no reason to be imprecise. He wrote about failures experiments that didn't produce the results he'd predicted, components that behaved differently in practice than they had in theory nights, when the mathematics had seemed solid until they weren't. He wrote about small victories in the same careful tone, refusing to celebrate more than the evidence warranted, which she recognized as the thinking of a scientist, even if the man had no formal scientific training. Between the technical entries, there were other things. September 2003. Went to town for supplies. Charlie at the hardware store gave me that look again. The one that says he thinks I'm wasting my time. Maybe I am, but when you've been laughed at as long as I have, you learn to use it as fuel. They laughed at me in school. They laughed when I said I could fix anything. They're still laughing now. Let them. I'll keep working. She read that entry twice. She knew that look. She'd been receiving her own version of it since September. Look that came at the end of job interviews that were clearly concluding 20 minutes before the interviewers said they were the look from people at the fair last night who thought they were being discreet about their amusement. The particular expression of people who have decided what something is worth before they've examined it properly and are too certain of their judgment to reconsider. Edmund Voss had been receiving that look for 30 years. She turned pages. The entries grew more focused over the years, centered on something he called the converter, capitalized always as if it were a proper noun, a name rather than a description. He wrote about prototypes and their failures, about a fundamental breakthrough in 2001 that he described with such careful understatement that she almost missed it. About refining and refining and refining the slow, patient work of someone who had nowhere else to be and no deadline but their own standards. She found the entry from 2006 that she would later return to many times. Finally understand why the resonance kept degrading. It was the coil spacing, not the composition, the spacing. 5 millimeters off across 200 windings. That's all it was. 5 millimeters times 200. Changed everything. Ran 3 tests tonight. Results consistent. Writing this down because I need to remember what it felt like to be wrong about something for 6 years and then understand it in an instant. That's the work. That's what the work actually is. And then the final entry, dated November 12th, 2019. The handwriting slightly different, slower, the letters still precise, but arrived at more carefully, the way you drive on roads you know well in weather that makes them unfamiliar. So tired now. The work is nearly done, but I'm running out of time. Can feel it in my bones, the way winter feels when you have lived through enough of them. If I don't finish, someone else will have to. The plans are all here. The pieces are all here. just need someone who believes enough to put them together. That's all any of us need, really. Someone who believes. Lena read the last paragraph once. Then she put her face in her hands and sat very still for a long moment in the kitchen of Edmund Voss's farmhouse at 3 in the morning, and she cried for the first time since Roy's funeral. Not just for Edmund Voss, she hadn't known him, she owed him nothing. She cried for the specific grief of 30 years of work that no one saw, for the loneliness of being certain of something that no one else believed in, for the particular cruelty of dying without knowing whether the thing you devoted your life to was real or just an elaborate fiction you'd told yourself to keep going. She cried until she was finished. Then she folded the journal carefully and set it on the table. She looked out the window at the barn. 50 yards away in the darkness, its doors closed, its windows dark. It held whatever Edmund Voss had left behind, the work of a man who'd believed in something so completely that 30 years of laughter hadn't been enough to stop him. Someone who believes he'd written. She picked up the journal and held it for a moment. "Okay," Lena Harwick said to an empty kitchen, to a dead man's words to herself. She went to find the barn. The main barn doors were secured with a padlock that had rusted to the color of old blood. She tried the keys on the ring one by one, the third one fit, and after significant persuasion, the lock released. She pulled the doors open, and the darkness inside was different from the darkness outside. Older, more settled, the dark of a place that had been closed for years and had arranged itself accordingly. She used the flashlight on her phone. The barn was larger inside than it appeared from outside, that particular spatial deception of old agricultural buildings, all their volume in the vertical space above the main floor. Concrete floor, cracked but solid. Hay bales stacked along one wall. A tractor in the corner gave flat tires and a carapace of dust that had taken years to accumulate to its current depth. Tools on pegboards, the outlines visible, even through the cobwebs, the habitual organization of someone who knew where everything was and intended it to stay that way. At the back of the barn, behind a wall of hay bales that she would later understand had been placed there deliberately, she found another door. Newer than the rest of the barn, a padlock also newer, and none of her keys fit it. She searched the barn for something useful and found a heavy wrench on a shelf near the tractor. It took 4 strikes. The lock gave. The door opened. She stepped through, flashlight first, and stopped. She had been an accountant for 22 years. She knew the value of things in the precise and unsentimental way of someone who had spent a career translating objects and effort into numbers. She was not a romantic about most things, or if she had been, the years had tempered it to something more sustainable. But the workshop of Edmund Voss took her breath away. Workbenches along 3 walls, their surfaces holding tools organized with an attention that was almost obsessive, everything in its place, everything labeled, the kind of arrangement that had been maintained not as a habit of tidiness, but as an act of respect for the work itself. Blueprints covered the walls, dozens of them, mechanical drawings and electrical schematics pinned and repinned over years until the walls had disappeared entirely behind them. A floor lamp in the corner, a stool at the main workbench, a coffee mug that still held a dark ring where the last cup had evaporated years ago. And in the center of the room on the main workbench, a device covered with a canvas tarp. Lena approached it the way you approach something you don't fully understand, carefully giving it the respect of attention. She put her hand on the tarp. She pulled it away. The device was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected functional objects to be. Copper coils wound with a precision that was immediately apparent even to someone who didn't understand their purpose. Thousands of perfect even windings that must have taken months to complete. Metal components fitted together with the patience of a person who measured success in millimeters, who was willing to take something apart 12 times to get the 13th attempt right. The whole assembled with an economy of purpose, nothing decorative, nothing wasted, every element in service of the thing the device was designed to do. It was incomplete. She could see that clearly. Wires hanging loose. Sections where components were obviously absent, their other places marked in Edmund's careful handwriting on masking tape labels that had yellowed but not fallen. But the craftsmanship, the sheer accumulated craftsmanship of it, the evidence of a mind that had been thinking about one problem for 30 years and had thought about it so completely that the thinking had become physical, had become this object, this precise and patient and unfinished thing. She stood there for a long time in the flashlight's beam. Edmund Voss had spent 30 years in this room, working alone, believing in something no one else could see, and he had built this real, physical, beautiful, unfinished thing. She reached out and touched the copper coils. They were cool, perfectly wound, not a millimeter of variation across their entire length. She looked around the workshop, the blueprints on the walls, the tools in their careful places, the labeled components waiting to be installed, the mug with its ghost of a ring where someone's last cup had been. And then she looked at the journal in her hand, at the final entry which she'd already memorized. Just needs someone who believes enough to put them together. Lena Harwick looked at the unfinished device of Edmund Voss and made a decision that she would not be able to fully explain to anyone, not to Colt, not to Merritt Calloway later, not to the crowd that would eventually gather in this space to witness what the decision had produced. She made it anyway. She would learn what he had been building. She would understand every blueprint on these walls, every component on these benches. She would make herself worthy of the work he'd left behind. And if it was possible, if it was even remotely possible, she would finish it. The flashlight beam held steady on the copper coils. Outside, the Iowa dark pressed against the barn walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and went quiet. She picked up one of the rolled blueprints from its labeled tube on the shelf. She carried it to the stool at the main workbench. And Lena Harwick, 55 years old, widowed, unemployed, the woman the town of Millhaven had laughed at for winning a worthless farm, sat down and began to read. The metal box hit the concrete floor with a sound like a gunshot. Lena had been reorganizing the cabinet in the back corner of the workshop, the one with the warped door that required lifting and pulling simultaneously, the kind of stubborn mechanism that rewards patience and punishes force. She'd been cataloging components, working through Edmund's labeling system, with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to quarterly reports, building a master inventory on the legal pad she'd started carrying everywhere in the workshop. When the cabinet's back panel shifted forward and the box tumbled out, she grabbed for it and missed. It landed hard. The combination lock held. She stood over it for a moment. It was a fireproof document box, the kind sold at hardware stores for keeping irreplaceable papers safe. Heavy-gauge steel with a 4-digit combination lock that had not been manufactured recently. The metal was scuffed along the corners in ways that suggested it had been moved often, hidden and retrieved, important enough to protect and important enough to keep close. She tried the obvious numbers first. The year on Edmund's earliest journal entry, 1994. The year printed on the property deed, 1987, when he'd bought the farm. Simple sequences, repeated digits. Nothing worked. She sat down on the stool and thought about it the way she thought about problems that required information she hadn't yet gathered. Systematically, starting from what she knew. She opened the journal to the page she was looking for. Somewhere in the middle years, 2004 or 2005, she remembered the approximate location Edmund had written about his mother. Not extensively, a single paragraph the way he wrote about personal things, briefly, carefully, as if emotions were technical data to be recorded accurately, but not dwelt upon. Mother would have been 78 today. She was the only one who never asked me to explain why I was doing this. Just nodded and said, "If you believe it's real, Edmund, then make it real." I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count. Still think about it. Happy birthday, Mom. Lena found the date of the entry, March 4th, 2004, which meant Edmund's mother's birthday was in early March. She did the arithmetic. If his mother would have been 78, in 2004 she was born in 1926. She tried 0304, then 0326, then 2603. The lock opened on the third attempt. Inside were letters. Not a few letters, a substantial collection organized with rubber bands into chronological groups, each bundle labeled in Edmund's handwriting on a strip of masking tape. The earliest bundle was dated 2003. The latest, 2007. 4 years of correspondence preserved in a fireproof box that Edmund Voss had kept hidden behind the back panel of a cabinet in his secret workshop, in a barn behind a wall of hay bales on a farm that a laughing crowd had raffled off to a woman they had already written off. He had protected these letters the way you protect something you know is evidence. Lena carried the box to the main workbench and positioned the floor lamp. She sat on the stool, pulled the first bundle free from its rubber band, and began to read. The first letter was dated September 8, 2003. Edmund had written it to someone named Dr. Nora Aldrich at the Department of Mechanical and Energy Engineering, Iowa State University. The letter was 2 pages handwritten in that same precise script, introducing himself and his work with the careful formality of someone who knew he was asking for something and understood the value of what he was asking for. Dear Dr. Aldrich, my name is Edmund Voss. I am a self-taught mechanical engineer working independently in Mill Haven, Iowa. I have been developing an energy conversion system for approximately 9 years. I believe the design has reached a stage where expert review could identify either its fundamental flaws or its legitimate potential, and I would very much appreciate your assessment of the enclosed calculations. He hadn't oversold it, hadn't performed confidence he didn't have. He'd stated his case plainly and let the work speak. Dr. Nora Aldrich had responded 12 days later. Her letter was typed departmental letterhead, professionally measured in tone, but the interest was there underneath the professionalism visible in the questions she asked, the specific components of Edmund's calculations she wanted to discuss further. She'd read the work. She'd understood enough of it to be genuinely curious. Your approach to the resonance problem is unconventional, but not without precedent. I would appreciate seeing your full schematic for the primary coil configuration. If your conversion ratio claims are accurate, and I am not yet in a position to assess whether they are, the implications for small-scale, rural power generation could be significant. Lena read both letters twice. Then she pulled the second bundle and kept going. The correspondence that followed across the next 4 years was something she hadn't expected, a genuine intellectual collaboration. Dr. Aldrich asked precise questions, and Edmund answered them with equal precision. She identified errors in his early calculations, and he corrected them without defensiveness, acknowledging the mistakes with the equanimity of someone who cared more about getting it right than about having been right. She suggested refinements to his coil geometry, and he tested them and reported back, sometimes confirming her suggestions, sometimes explaining why a different approach had proven more effective in practice. Between the technical exchanges, something else developed: a rapport. The letters grew slightly less formal over the years, not unprofessional, but the stiffness of two strangers fell away, replaced by the particular ease of people who have found they share a language. Edmund wrote once about working until 2 in the morning on a problem Nora had identified, and feeling for the first time that he was not entirely alone in the work. Nora responded that she looked forward to his letters more than most of what arrived in her faculty mailbox, which said something she chose not to elaborate on about the state of academic correspondence. Lena was on the third bundle, 2006, when the tone began to change. Not in Nora's letters initially. Edmund's first. He wrote about preparing a patent application. He'd been documenting everything methodically, he said, had been doing so since the beginning. Actually, the journal was proof of that, and he believed the work had reached a stage where formal protection was not just advisable but necessary. He asked Nora if she'd be willing to review the application and provide a letter of support. Her response was warm, enthusiastic even. She offered not only to review the application, but to provide documentation from their correspondence, establishing the timeline of Edmund's independent development. She said she believed his work deserved formal recognition, and she was glad to help him secure it. That letter was dated March 2007. The next letter in the bundle was not from Nora Aldrich. It was from the Office of Legal Affairs, Iowa State University. Lena read it once quickly, then again slowly. The language was careful. Institutional language always was designed to communicate without committing, to inform without acknowledging. But the meaning was clear enough. Edmund's proposed patent application covered technology substantially similar to research currently being conducted within university programs. The letter strongly advised him to consult legal counsel before proceeding, as there might be questions of intellectual property that would need to be resolved before his application could move forward. Then 3 rejection letters from the patent office, each citing different technical grounds, each arriving at the same conclusion: application denied. Then Nora's final letter, 1 page, typed. The departmental letterhead at the top, but the signature at the bottom was different, smaller, as if written quickly, or as if the hand that wrote it was uncertain. Dear Edmund, I am writing to tell you with sincere regret that I have been advised by my department to cease all external collaboration on topics related to my current research program. I cannot provide documentation supporting your patent application, as the material in question has become part of a university research initiative, and any documentation I provide could create legal complications I am not in a position to manage. I am sorry. I wish things were different. I hope your work finds its way forward somehow. That was all. Lena stared at the letter for a long time, then she turned it over. On the back in Edmund Voss's handwriting, not the careful, deliberate script of the journal entries, but something faster pressed harder into the paper, the writing of a man who needed to put something down before the feeling passed 3 words. They took everything. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at Edmund's workbench until the Iowa dawn came gray and gradual through the workshop's single high window. The metal box open in front of her. The letters spread in their chronological order across the bench surface. The evidence arranged the way she would have arranged a client's financials when she was trying to understand a discrepancy. Everything visible, everything in sequence. The story told by the documents themselves without editorial comment. The story the documents told was this: Edmund Voss had spent 9 years developing something before he reached out to Dr. Nora Aldrich in 2003. He had shared everything with her over the following 4 years: calculations, schematics, breakthrough insights, the foundational intellectual architecture of his work, in good faith as a collaboration between an independent inventor and an academic expert, the way such collaborations were supposed to work. Then in 2007, when Edmund had tried to protect what he'd created, the university had intervened. Someone not Nora, she suspected, or not only Nora, had seen commercial potential in what Edmund had developed, had understood its implications for grant funding and research programs and the particular academic prestige that came from being first, and had moved to claim it. The 3 patent rejections. The legal letter designed to make Edmund believe his own application was problematic. Nora's silence purchased or coerced or simply chosen because the cost of speaking was more than she'd been willing to pay. And Edmund had been left with nothing. No patent, no credit, no acknowledgement. Just the workshop and the blueprints in the journal and 30 more years of work on something the world would never know he'd built first. When the window lightened enough to read by, Lena opened her laptop. She found the Iowa State University Department of Mechanical and Energy Engineering website without difficulty. The department's research page featured extensive coverage of their work in sustainable power generation breakthrough innovations. The language said pioneering research, nationally recognized advances in rural energy access. The descriptions were accompanied by grant figures that ran into the millions. The research had been ongoing, apparently, for nearly 2 decades. She found the patents, 3 of them filed between 2008 and 2010. The technical descriptions were dense. She read them slowly, cross-referencing against the blueprints on Edmund's walls, using the vocabulary she'd spent the past month learning from engineering forums and tutorial videos, and the careful marginal notes Edmund had left in his blueprints for exactly this kind of reader. She wasn't an engineer, but she'd been studying these designs for weeks, and she knew them well enough now to understand what she was reading. The core concepts in the university's patents were Edmund's. Not identical to his final design, there were differences, modifications, refinements that bore the mark of formal engineering training, but the foundational architecture, the specific approach to the resonance problem, the essential insight that made the whole system work, those were his. She could see it clearly. The way you can see once you know what you're looking at, that a copy and an original share the same underlying structure, even when the surface details differ. She searched for the lead inventors listed on the patents. Dr. Nora Aldrich was there, and there, first listed on all 3, the named inventor, the credited pioneer, was someone she hadn't encountered in the letters: Professor Burton Grail. Department head 2001 to 2019, currently Professor Emeritus. She found his faculty page. Silver-haired man in his late 70s, photographed in what appeared to be a university laboratory, smiling with the comfortable ease of someone who had long ago made peace with his own importance. His biography listed the patents prominently. Research grants from federal agencies totaling more than $4 million. A named professorship endowed by a technology company that had licensed the patents. Awards for innovation in sustainable energy research, including one from a National Engineering Society that described him as a visionary who transformed the field. She sat with that word for a moment. Visionary. Then she looked at the wall of blueprints in Edmund Voss's workshop. at the careful handwriting in the margins, at the date stamps on the journal entries, 1994, forward 9 years of documented independent development before he had ever written a single letter to Iowa State University. Visionary. She closed the laptop. She started working at Briggs Hardware on a Monday. Arlo Briggs ran the store with the unpretentious directness of someone who had been selling tools and building materials for 30 years and had arrived at a clean understanding of what the job actually required. He was in his early 60s, gray at the temples, with the kind of forearms that came from decades of physical work rather than deliberate exercise. He'd looked at Lena when she'd come in to ask about part-time work and had spent about 15 seconds deciding. "You know how to use a level?" he'd asked. "I know which end to hold," she'd said. "Can you start Wednesday?" The work was straightforward: stocking shelves, helping customers locate things, unloading delivery trucks on the days they came. The employee discount was the point. Every week she bought components from the list she'd compiled from Edmund's blueprints, the specific capacitors, the gauge wire, the voltage regulator, with its particular specifications. Some items she ordered online and had shipped to the store. Others Arlo stocked as a matter of course, because they were the kinds of things that serious people in serious situations consistently needed. She spent her mornings in the workshop with the blueprints, afternoons at the hardware store, evenings back in the workshop installing whatever she'd acquired that week, checking every connection against the schematics before making it permanent. The work was slow. She made mistakes and found them and corrected them. She posted questions on engineering forums under a username that didn't identify her and received answers from people who knew things she didn't and shared them freely the way knowledge moves between people who care about getting things right. The house she'd cleaned and made livable in the first week. She'd fixed the leaking kitchen faucet, replaced the worst of the window panes, patched the places where weather had found gaps in the exterior walls. It was habitable now, not comfortable in any conventional sense. The furniture was Edmund's, old and worn and arranged by a person with different habits than her own, but habitable. She'd found a pattern that worked. Vivian Pruitt came on a Thursday in late October, walking carefully up the porch steps with a cane and a covered dish that turned out to be a beef stew that smelled like an argument for the existence of goodness in the world. She was 74, white-haired, with the kind of eyes that had been paying attention to things for a long time and knew the difference between what people said and what they meant. She'd lived 2 miles down rural Route 9 for 40 years. Her late husband had done metal fabrication work out of his garage, custom parts, specialized components for agricultural equipment, the kind of precision work that required knowing materials well. "I knew Edmund," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. "Not closely, but we were neighbors for 30 years. Harlan, my husband, helped him sometimes. Edmund would come over with drawings, ask questions about how to shape certain pieces. Always brought something when he came. Pie or preserves, or once memorably a very large zucchini." "What was he like?" Lena asked. Vivian considered this with the care the question deserved. "Brilliant, kind, lonely, I think, though he never complained about it. The town thought he was peculiar. Maybe he was, but peculiar and useless aren't the same thing. He was just pointed somewhere the rest of us couldn't see." She looked at Lena with the directness of someone who had no remaining patience for indirection. "You found the workshop." It wasn't a question. "I did," Lena said. "And the device." "Yes." "Are you going to finish it?" The question sat between them. Lena had been asking herself a version of it for weeks, not whether but how, which was, she supposed, its own kind of answer. "I'm working on it," she said. Vivian nodded slowly as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Harlan's workshop is still in our barn. Equipment, specialized tools. Some things he collected over 40 years that I haven't known what to do with. Edmund helped us more times than I can count. It seems right that his work should benefit from what Harlan left behind." She set down her coffee cup. "You come by whenever you need to." She was at the hardware store on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-November, restocking a shelf of pipe fittings with the methodical efficiency of someone for whom restocking shelves had become genuinely restful when the bell above the door announced a customer. She heard Arlo's greeting from the front counter, heard the response. The voice was male, confident, the kind of voice that had spent decades being listened to in rooms where listening was expected. She didn't see the face until she came around the end of the aisle with an armful of elbow joints to find a man in his late 70s examining a display of electrical connectors with the particular detachment of someone who has no real interest in what they're looking at. Silver-haired, well-dressed in the understated way of someone who had stopped needing to perform status. The face from the faculty webpage somewhat older than the photograph, but recognizable. Professor Burton Grail. He looked up when she appeared at the end of the aisle, and recognition crossed his face with the ease of someone who kept track of relevant information. He smiled warmly, generously, the practiced warmth of a man who had spent a career performing accessibility to people who needed to believe he was approachable. "You must be the woman who won the Voss farm," he said, as if this were a pleasant coincidence rather than the only reason he was standing in this particular hardware store in this particular small town where he had no other apparent business. "I have a weekend place about 4 miles out, Harrow Road." He extended his hand. "Burton Grail." She shook it. "Lena Harwick." "How are you finding the property? I imagine it needs considerable work." He said it with a sympathy that was perfect in its calibration, just enough concern to seem genuine, not enough to be patronizing. "Poor old Edmund. Strange fellow, but harmless enough. We actually knew of him at the university. He corresponded with some of our faculty years back. Enthusiastic, if a bit." He made a small gesture that managed to convey misguided without saying the word. "I hope you find some use for that land. It's good acreage, fundamentally." "Thank you," Lena said. Her voice was even, her hands were steady. "If you're thinking of selling, I know a few people who might be interested. Rural land values have been moving up." He smiled again. "Just a thought. No pressure." He purchased a package of electrical connectors. She noted the type, automatically cross-referenced them against her mental inventory, understood they were not for any project he was actually working on, and left. She watched his car pull out of the lot from the front window. "You know him?" Arlo asked, coming up beside her. "I know of him," she said carefully. Her hands, she noticed, had gone completely still, the stillness of something held under deliberate control, rather than anything approaching calm. Burton Grail had looked her in the face and spoken about Edmund Voss with sympathy, had described him as strange and misguided. The same words the town had used, the same words that had enabled 30 years of dismissal, the same words that had made it easy to take something from a man because no one thought he was worth defending. She finished her shift without a word about it. She drove home through the early dark of November. She sat at the workbench in Edmund's workshop and looked at the device for a long moment, at the copper coils, the careful components, the masking tape labels in Edmund's handwriting, marking the places where the missing pieces needed to go. She thought about Grail standing in that hardware store aisle buying connectors he didn't need, smiling the smile of a man who had spent 20 years believing the story he'd told about himself was the true one. Then she opened her laptop and wrote the email. She kept it simple, factual, without accusation. "Dear Dr. Aldrich, my name is Lena Harwick. I recently acquired the farm of Edmund Voss through a property transfer in Millhaven, Iowa. While settling the property, I discovered a collection of correspondence between Mr. Voss and yourself spanning the years 2003 to 2007, along with his workshop, his technical documentation, and the device he was developing at the time of your collaboration. I have spent the past several weeks studying his work and believe I am close to completing the prototype. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about Mr. Voss's contributions to the field if you are willing." She read it 3 times, changed nothing, sent it. Then she went back to work on the device because the work was something she could control, and control was what she needed right now. The response came in 2 hours. Not a formal reply. A single line, "Please call me. Here is my cell number." I have been waiting for something like this letter for a very long time. They spoke that evening. Lena sat on the porch of the farmhouse with her phone and a blanket against the November cold, watching stars appear in the Iowa sky in their unhurried way, and Dr. Nora Aldrich spoke from her office 300 miles away with the voice of someone releasing something they had been holding for 18 years. She was in her early 60s now, had been an untenured junior professor when she'd first written to Edmund Voss, had been told by Burton Grail in his capacity as department head that the correspondence with Voss was now a matter of university interest, that the intellectual property questions were complex and would need to be handled by the appropriate channels, and that her cooperation would be noted. She had understood what cooperation meant. She had understood what noted meant. I told myself it was practical, she said. The November night was very quiet around Lena. That this was how academia worked. That Edmund didn't have the resources to navigate the patent process anyway, and at least the university would use the technology responsibly. I told myself a lot of things. A pause. None of them were actually true. They were just ways of making a thing I was doing sound like a thing that was being done to me. Who made the decision? Lena asked. About filing the patents. Grail. It was entirely Grail. No hesitation. He'd seen my notes from our correspondence. I'd presented some of Edmund's work at a faculty meeting, which I understand now was exactly the wrong thing to do. Grail saw the commercial potential immediately. He had relationships with technology licensing groups. He knew how to move things through the university's IP office. Another pause longer. Edmund's bad timing was applying for the patent when he did. Grail had already been in conversation with the licensing office for months. He had the institutional machinery on his side. Edmund had a journal and some letters and no lawyer and no money. And Grail built his career on it. His entire late career. The patents, the grants, the named professorship, the awards. The legacy he retired with. Her voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone testifying. Edmund died in 2020, believing he had wasted his life. He never knew that his ideas had succeeded, just not in his name. Lena looked out at the barn, at the light she'd left on in the workshop visible as a thin line under the barn doors. I've completed the device, she said. Almost. A few more components. I believe it will work. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. If you're planning to do something about this, Nora Aldrich said at last, I will help you. I have documentation, emails, meeting notes, internal memos from 2007. I kept everything. I kept it because somewhere in me, I knew this day would have to come eventually. It took longer than it should have. A breath. I'll testify if it comes to that. I'll provide whatever evidence I have. It won't undo what I did, but it's something. The call ended at midnight. Lena stayed on the porch after not quite ready to go inside. The night was clear and very cold, the stars sharp in the way they get in rural Iowa, when there's nothing between you and them, and she sat in the cold and thought about Edmund Voss working alone in that barn for 30 years, writing his precise, careful journal entries, refining his copper coils to within a millimeter of perfection, believing no one would ever understand what he'd built. She thought about what Nora had said. He never knew that his ideas had succeeded. Then she went back to the workshop. The final component arrived on a Friday, a specialized voltage regulator she'd ordered through the hardware store, technically complex enough that she'd spent 3 evenings confirming she understood its function before she trusted herself to install it. She'd cross-referenced the installation against Edmund's blueprint 4 times. She'd checked the connection points twice. She'd verified the calibration against the specifications in his marginal notes. She installed it on a Saturday morning. Outside it was raining, the light patient rain of late November in Iowa, the kind that doesn't insist on itself but has no intention of stopping. She'd lit the floor lamp and positioned it to give her the best angle on the work. She'd laid out her tools in the order she'd need them, the way Edmund had always done, the way she'd inherited from his example without meaning to. When the last connection was made, she sat back and looked at the device. Complete. For the first time since 1994, Edmund Voss's energy converter was complete. She stood up, went to the control panel on the right side of the bench, located the main power switch exactly where the blueprint indicated it would be. She put her hand on it. She thought about calling someone, Colt, Vivian, even Arlo, having a witness to whatever happened next. But this moment had been Edmund's for 30 years, and it felt right that his witness should be the one person who had chosen to believe in it. She threw the switch. The device woke slowly, the way something comes back to life after long stillness, reluctantly, at first, then with gathering purpose. A low hum that began below the threshold of hearing and built. The copper coils began to move so slowly at first that she thought she was imagining it, then, with unmistakable rotation. The gauges on the control panel stirred. Numbers appeared on the digital display and began to climb, voltage, amperage, frequency, rising toward the ranges Edmund had predicted in the blueprints, the ranges he'd written about in the journal, as the theoretical target of 30 years of work. The system stabilized. Lena checked the output meter. The conversion ratio was beyond anything she'd seen in the commercial literature she'd been reading for weeks. The efficiency of the system, the ratio of output to input, exceeded current technology by a margin that, had she read it in a journal article, she would have assumed was a misprint. She'd connected an output to a test strip, a simple power strip with a work lamp, a space heater she'd brought from the farmhouse. She flipped the connection switch. The work lamp blazed on bright and immediate and certain. The space heater's element began to glow. The workshop. Edmund's workshop, where he had worked alone for 3 decades in a cold, she now understood viscerally was lit and warm, powered by the device he had built. Lena sat down on the floor, not because her legs failed her, because the moment it required that she be at the same level as the thing Edmund had spent his life building. Eye level with the copper coils. Present to it in the way that standing upright wouldn't allow. She pressed her palm flat against the concrete floor, cold, solid, real, and held it there. The floor Edmund had stood on for 30 years. The floor that had held the weight of his certainty when nothing else would. The hum filled the workshop. The warm light fell across the blueprints on the walls, across the labeled tools in their careful places, across the mug, with its ghost of a coffee ring, across everything Edmund had left behind for someone who would believe enough to find it. It works, she thought, not to herself, to the room, to the blueprints, to the man whose photograph she'd carried in Roy's jacket pocket since the first morning that she'd found it in the kitchen drawer. Edmund, you were right. You were right the whole time. She stayed there until the cold of the concrete came through her jeans and the lamp above her burned steady and the gauges held their numbers without flinching. Then she got up. She called Colt first. He answered on the second ring, which was new. She'd noticed he'd been answering faster lately since the newspaper article Henrietta from the Mill Haven Courier had written after a conversation they had had at Briggs Hardware. Colt had read the article, had texted, "I didn't know about any of this." "Can we talk, Mom?" he said when he picked up. His voice had something in it that hadn't been there before, something careful and open like a door held ajar. "I've been thinking about what you're doing out there." "I need to tell you something," she said. "The device works. Edmund's device. I turned it on an hour ago and it works exactly as he designed it." Silence. "Then, Mom, are you sure? I've run it for 40 minutes. Every measurement is within his predicted ranges. Colt, what he built, what they took from him, it's real. It actually works." Another silence. Longer. "Mom," he said, and his voice had shifted into something she hadn't heard from him in a very long time since he was young. Maybe since before the years had taught him to be careful with what he showed. "I don't understand who Edmund Voss was to you, but I want to. Can I come out there this weekend?" She looked around the workshop. At the device on the bench, still running its steady note, filling the space Edmund had made for it. "Yes," she said. "Come." Then she called Nora Aldrich to tell her the device was real and ask if she was ready for what came next. Nora went quiet for the long moment on the other end, and when she spoke, her voice carried something that sounded like relief, so old it had almost forgotten what it was waiting for. "I'm ready," she said. "I've been ready for 18 years. Then Merritt Calloway, who answered on the first ring and said only, "I've been waiting for this call. Come Monday. Bring everything." The NIPA number she'd found online while researching independent inventor cases. She left a message. They called back in 20 minutes, a staff attorney named Rosalind Vickers, who asked 3 precise questions and said at the end, "Ms. Harwick, what you're describing is exactly what we exist to address. Let's talk Monday." She set the phone down. Outside, the November rain had softened to something barely audible. The device hummed, the lamp burned. The blueprints held their careful lines on Edmund's walls, the record of 30 years of belief in something no one else could see. Lena picked up her legal pad and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Then she wrote in the accountant's habit of beginning every document with its subject, clearly stated Edmund Voss. What they took, what remains, what we do next. She underlined it, then she began to write. Grail came on a Tuesday night, 11 days before the demonstration. Lena heard the car first headlights sweeping across the kitchen ceiling, through the window and the crunch of tires on gravel that had become unfamiliar enough to be notable. It was past 9. Colt had driven back to Des Moines that afternoon to retrieve the rest of his remote work equipment, planning to return Thursday and stay through the demonstration. Vivian had gone home after dinner. The farm was quiet in the particular way it got after dark in November, the kind of quiet that has weight and texture that you feel against your skin. She went to the window before going to the door. The car was a black sedan, expensive and anonymous. The man who got out moved with the deliberate unhurriedness of someone who was accustomed to other people waiting. He wore a dark coat. The security light above the barn caught the silver of his hair. She recognized him immediately. She stood at the window for 3 full seconds. Then she went to the door and opened it before he could knock, which she did deliberately. She wanted him to know she'd seen him coming. Bert and Grail stood on Edmund Voss's porch in the November dark and looked at her with an expression that had been assembled carefully on the drive over. Concerned, reasonable, the face of a man paying a neighborly visit to address a misunderstanding before it became something more complicated than it needed to be. "Ms. Harwick," he said, "I'm sorry to come by so late. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You are," she said, "but go ahead." Something moved briefly in his eyes, reassessment, she thought. He'd expected something easier. "May I come in?" "No," she said. "You can say what you came to say from there." He absorbed this, adjusted. "I understand you have been in contact with Nora Aldrich." He kept his voice measured, collegial, as if they were discussing a scheduling conflict. "And that you're planning some kind of public demonstration. I wanted to have a conversation before things proceed in a direction that doesn't serve anyone well." "What direction would serve everyone well in your view? Honestly." He shifted his weight, and in the shift, she saw something more real than the managed expression, a man who had spent a career controlling narratives and was beginning to suspect this one was moving too fast for him. Edmund Voss was a talented amateur. What happened with the patent process was complicated. Institutional decisions were made that I'm not certain in retrospect were handled ideally. There may have been a failure to properly credit preliminary external contributions. Preliminary external contributions. She held those words in her mind and examined them the way she examined a balance sheet that didn't balance, looking for where the numbers had been moved to make the deficit disappear. "What Edmund Voss did," she said, "was invent the core technology your patents are based on. What you did was take it from him using your department's institutional authority because you knew he couldn't afford to fight back." Grail's expression didn't break exactly, but it changed the way ice changes just before it gives, not yet failed, but no longer entirely solid. "That's a very serious characterization of events," he said. "It's the one the documents support." A pause. The November night was cold around them both. From inside the workshop, the faint, steady hum of Edmund's device carried through the barn wall, barely audible but present. Grail heard it. She watched him hear it, watched something shift in his face when he understood what that sound was. "Ms. Harwick." His voice had dropped into something quieter, now the register of a man making an offer rather than an argument. "I'm going to be direct with you. A public confrontation serves no one. Edmund is gone. Nora is in a fragile professional position. The university has programs, students' ongoing research that would be disrupted by the kind of spectacle you appear to be organizing. I'm prepared to discuss appropriate acknowledgement of Edmund's contributions, financial recognition for your time and effort in completing his work, a private arrangement that honors what he built without burning down everything that was built after him." He let that sit. She looked at him for a long moment, at the silver hair in the careful coat and the face that had assembled itself into generosity, at the man who had built an entire celebrated career on Edmund Voss's ideas, who had accepted awards and grants and a named professorship, and who had come to her door 11 days before a public demonstration to offer her money to be quiet. "Edmund Voss heard an offer like that once," she said, "from your institution in 2007. They offered to handle things through appropriate channels. He trusted that offer." She held the door. "Good night, Professor Grail." She closed it. She stood in the front hallway and listened to his footsteps on the porch, the creak of the steps, the sound of his car door, the engine. The headlights swept across the ceiling again in reverse as he turned around in the driveway. Then the farm was quiet again. She went to the kitchen and sat at the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed slowly until her hands stopped trembling. Not from fear, she was clear about that. From the enormous effort of saying the right thing instead of every other thing she'd wanted to say, which would have been satisfying in the moment and tactically foolish. She picked up her phone and sent 2 texts. One to Merritt Calloway Grail came to the farm tonight, offered a private settlement. I declined. You'll want to know this before Thursday. One to Colt. Come back sooner, if you can. Things are moving. Then she went to the workshop, sat at Edmund's bench, and worked until midnight. The demonstration had been Merritt's idea, developed 3 weeks earlier at Vivian's kitchen table when Lena had laid out the full evidence for the first time. He'd read through every document with the methodical attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and had found more than he'd expected. When he finished, he removed his reading glasses and said, "Textbook." They chose him because they knew he couldn't fight back. The legal language in that university letter is designed specifically to make a layperson believe their own claim is invalid. I've seen it before. Different institutions, same playbook. He'd taken the case without hesitation. Now with the demonstration 11 days out and Grail's visit on record, Merritt moved with new urgency. He'd been in contact with the National Innovation Protection Alliance, NIP, since the week after Henrietta's article ran in the Millhaven Courier and got picked up by a regional wire service. Rosalind Vickers had been direct. What had happened to Edmund Voss was not unusual, but the documentation was extraordinary. The timeline was clear. The correspondence predated the patents by years. Nora Aldrich's willingness to testify was, Rosalind said, the piece that transformed a strong case into an almost unassailable one. Universities fight hard, she told Lena during a 3-way call with Merritt. Their legal departments are well-resourced, and they understand that most people can't sustain a prolonged legal battle. But they hate publicity more than they hate legal losses. Especially this kind of publicity, a self-taught inventor working alone, robbed of a lifetime's work by the institution that should have championed him. That is a story that travels. Then let's make sure it travels, Lena said. Colt arrived Wednesday evening. He came through the front door with his laptop bag and a duffel and stopped in the hallway looking at the house with the eyes of someone seeing it properly for the first time. He'd come out twice since that first weekend, had helped Lena move, furniture, had fixed the porch light, had done the practical, useful things that were his instinct when he didn't know what else to offer. But something was different now. He was looking at the house not as a problem to be assessed, but as a place. Lena watched him figure that out. They ate dinner at Edmund's kitchen table, her table now. She was starting to think of it, the distinction between Edmund's and hers softening as she understood better what she was stewarding. And Colt asked her to walk him through the whole case from the beginning. Not the version she'd been summarizing for lawyers and journalists. The full version. Starting with the night she'd read the first journal entry at 3 in the morning. She told him. He listened the way Roy used to listen, without interrupting, without redirecting, without overlaying his own interpretation onto what she was saying before she'd finished saying it. She hadn't noticed until this conversation that Colt had relearned how to do that, or maybe had always known and she'd forgotten, because they'd been so careful around each other for so long that real listening had seemed like a risk neither of them was taking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's like you, Colt said finally. Edmund. He was overlooked and underestimated for years, and he just kept building anyway. Because the work was real regardless of whether anyone believed it. She hadn't thought of it in those terms, heard it and recognized it was true. Your father used to say, she started and then stopped. What? He used to say that the loneliest thing in the world isn't being alone. It's being certain of something that no one else can see yet. She looked at her coffee cup. I didn't really understand that when he said it. I do now. Colt looked at her across the table at his mother in a dead man's kitchen in a small Iowa town she'd won in a raffle, and she saw something settle in his face that had been unsettled for a long time. I've been so far away, he said. Not geographically. They both understood that. I know. I didn't know how to after Dad. He stopped, started again. I thought if I kept moving fast enough, kept the work demanding enough, I wouldn't have to figure out what was left when I slowed down. He looked at his hands. That was a cowardly way to handle it. It was a human way to handle it, she said. Your father would have said so. He would have also said, I owed you better. He would have said that too, she agreed. They sat with that for a moment, and the moment was not uncomfortable. Something that had been tight between them for 3 years, released with the quiet specificity of things that have been held too long and finally carefully let go. So, Colt said, straightening, the Swiss watch precision returning, but warmer now pointed at something worth measuring. Tell me what you need for the demonstration, and then tell me how I can help. The demonstration was scheduled for the first Saturday of December. In the days leading up to it, Millhaven did what small towns do when something is happening. It talked. The talking moved through the networks that small towns run on church bulletins and hardware store conversations, and the particular velocity of information in places where everyone knows the channels. Vivian's church group. Arlo, who mentioned it to every customer with the casual certainty of someone who understood its significance. Henrietta, whose follow-up article in the Courier had been the most read piece in the paper's recent history. The regional television station sent a crew. A producer from a national morning news program called and asked if Lena would be available for a satellite interview. A freelance journalist who'd been tracking rural inventor stories for a national magazine reached out to Henrietta, who connected him to Merritt. Lena redirected most media inquiries to Merritt. This was not about her becoming known. It was about Edmund being remembered. The university's legal department called Merritt on the Thursday before the demonstration. They wanted the event canceled, or failing that, they wanted assurances that no legally actionable claims would be made on camera. Merritt's response was measured and brief. Lena Harwick intended to demonstrate a device built by Edmund Voss on Edmund Voss's property according to Edmund Voss's designs. If that raised concerns for the university, he suggested they spend some time examining why. The request for an emergency injunction was filed Friday morning and denied Friday afternoon. The judge's written refusal was 4 sentences, the last of which noted that demonstrating one's own property, using one's own documentation on one's own land, did not constitute actionable harm to a third party's intellectual property claims. Merritt called Lena after the ruling. "They're scared," he said. "Good." Nora Aldrich called that evening. She was in Iowa City, had driven from Ames that afternoon. She'd booked a room at the small motel on Route 30. "I want to be there tomorrow," she said. "Not just as a witness. I want to speak if you'll let me." "I wasn't going to ask you to," Lena said. "I know, I'm asking myself." A pause. "I've been not speaking for 18 years. I'm done with that." Saturday came with the particular generosity of early December in Iowa, a morning cold and clear, the sky, the deep blue that only appears when the air has been cleaned by recent cold, everything sharp-edged and bright in a way that felt like a gift you hadn't earned but were being given anyway. By noon, cars were arriving. Arlo came first with his truck and 2 sawhorses and a practical efficiency that asked no questions and required no direction. He helped Lena and Colt set up the borrowed folding chairs in rows facing the workshop entrance, 150 of them, which had seemed like too many when she'd ordered them from the community center, and now, by 1 o'clock, was beginning to seem like possibly not enough. Vivian arrived with her church group, 8 older people, who had known Edmund Voss in the peripheral way of small-town acquaintance, seen him at the feed store, nodded at his truck on rural Route 9, formed impressions of him across 30 years of proximity that had never quite resolved into knowledge. They came with the bearing of people who understood they were there partly to pay a debt. Henrietta sat up near the front with her notebook and a photographer. The regional TV crew positioned their camera with a sight line to the workshop entrance. A man Lena didn't recognize set up a second camera near the bus, the freelance journalist working now with a photographer he'd brought from Des Moines. By 2 o'clock, more than 150 people had come. The folding chairs were full. People stood along the sides and at the back. Others sat on the ground in the cold without being asked to, which was the voluntary discomfort of people who understand they're witnessing something that matters and are willing to be slightly uncomfortable for it. Lena stood at the workshop entrance and looked at them. She had not expected this. She'd expected 30, maybe 40. Neighbors, a few curious townspeople, some faces she recognized from Briggs Hardware. Instead, she was looking at Millhaven, at something close to a meaningful cross-section of a town of 3,200 people gathered on a dead man's farm on a cold December Saturday because a story had reached them and they'd decided it was worth showing up for. She found Colt in the crowd, standing to one side with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was holding something in. He caught her eye and nodded once. She found Nora Aldrich near the back, seated in one of the last chairs, dressed simply, her face carrying the specific composure of someone who has decided what they're going to do and is waiting for the right moment. She found Vivian in the third row, her cane propped against the chair beside her, watching Lena with the steady attention of someone who has been paying the right kind of attention for a very long time. And she found Burton Grail at the edge of the crowd, standing outside the arc of the folding chairs, near the gap in the fence that led back toward the driveway. He wore the same dark coat. His hands were in his pockets. He was watching with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance, something between assessment and something older. Something that might, in a different kind of man, have been called recognition. He had come anyway, she noted it, set it aside, turned to face the crowd. 6 months ago, she began. I won this farm in a raffle. Her voice was steady. She hadn't prepared remarks, had written a few notes on an index card, and then left the card on the kitchen table, deciding that the moment required honesty rather than preparation, and honesty was harder to produce from notes. People laughed. I didn't blame them. The place was a wreck. A few smiles in the crowd, the acknowledgement of a truth. I had no idea what I was walking into. No plan, no understanding of what this land held. She paused. What it held was the life's work of a man named Edmund Voss. She told it simply, without drama, without performance. The journal, the workshop, the device under the canvas tarp, the blueprints that had covered the walls like the accumulated evidence of a mind that had been thinking about one problem for 30 years and had thought about it deeply enough to fill a room with the thinking. She told them about Edmund, the man, what the journal had revealed of him. The precise, careful handwriting. The refusal to oversell his own conclusions. The entries that recorded failure with the same methodical attention as a breakthrough, because he understood that failure was data, and data was what the work required. The single paragraph about his mother, who had told him, if you believe it's real, Edmund, then make it real. She told him he had believed it was real. Edmund Voss died in 2020, she said. He died believing he had failed, that his work had been for nothing, that 30 years in this workshop had produced nothing the world would ever see or care about. She looked out at the faces watching her. I want to show you why that belief was wrong. She stepped aside from the workshop entrance. The device was visible now to the whole crowd, positioned on its display stand. In the center of the workshop, the overhead light falling across the copper coils, the carefully assembled components, the craftsmanship that was apparent even from a distance. The blueprints were mounted on the walls behind it, enlarged, and printed Edmund's technical drawings visible to anyone who cared to look. Several people stood automatically for a better view. The movement rippled through the crowd. She explained the principles, simply how the system worked, what the components did, why the conversion ratio it achieved was significant. She showed them a key blueprint, pointed to Edmund's marginal notes, let them see the evidence of the thinking that had produced the design. Then she powered it on. The startup sequence was familiar to her now. The low hum building, the coils beginning their rotation, the gauges climbing toward their operating ranges. But she watched the crowd instead of the device, and what she saw on their faces as the hum became audible and the display lit up and the numbers climbed toward Edmund's predicted values, that was worth watching. She'd connected the output to a power strip with 4 devices, a work lamp, a space heater, a small refrigerator she'd brought from the farmhouse, and a power drill she'd borrowed from Arlo. She flipped the switches one by one. The lamp blazed on. The heater's element began to glow orange. The refrigerator's compressor engaged with a quiet mechanical certainty. The drill spun at full speed in Colt's hand, who was holding it near the front of the crowd, and several people near him flinched slightly at the sound before they understood what they were seeing. The power meter on the output panel showed the device generating more energy than it consumed. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the crowd broke. Not polite applause, real applause, the involuntary kind that happens when something exceeds what you thought was possible, when evidence lands with enough force to change what you believe. People were on their feet. Some were talking to the people beside them. A woman in the third row, late 60s. Someone Lena didn't know put her hand over her mouth. Arlo, standing to the left, looked at the power meter with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was seeing and was experiencing, something between professional admiration and grief that it had taken this long. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set and did not wipe the tears that ran down the side of his face, and Lana did not look at him directly because some things between people who work together are understood without being said. Lena let it run for 10 minutes. Let them watch the gauges, hold steady. Let the evidence accumulate. Then she shut the system down and turned to face them. Edmund Voss built that, she said. The crowd quieted. A self-taught mechanic from this town, a man you may have seen around Millhaven, may have passed on the street, may have, she let the pause carry what it needed to carry, dismissed. He created something that could genuinely change how rural communities access affordable power. He should have been celebrated. Another pause. Instead, he was robbed. The mood shifted. She felt it physically, the change in the air of a crowd when something moves from celebration to something heavier and more necessary. Merritt Calloway stepped forward. He outlined the case in the measured, precise language of a man who had spent 40 years making complex things clear, the dated correspondence, the timeline showing Edmund's documented development, predating the university's patents by years. The internal documents obtained through Nora Aldrich, establishing that department leadership had been fully briefed on Edmund's designs before the patent applications were filed. He named Burton Grail. He did it without drama, without prosecutorial flourish, in the same even tone he'd used for everything else, which made it more damning than any performance would have been. Then Nora Aldrich stood up. No one had introduced her. She rose from her chair in the third-to-last row without being asked, and the crowd parted slightly as she made her way to the front. And she stood before 150 people at Edmund Voss's farm on a clear December morning and said what she'd needed to say for 18 years. My name is Dr. Nora Aldrich. I am a professor of mechanical engineering at Iowa State University. I collaborated with the Edmund Voss for 4 years. He shared everything with me, his calculations, his designs, his insights. Everything you saw demonstrated today was born in correspondence between us, correspondence in which Edmund was the innovator, and I was the learned person who finally understood what he was doing. She paused. Her voice was composed. She had prepared for this. When my department head saw commercial potential in Edmund's work, I was pressured to provide access to his complete technical documentation. I was told the university would handle the patent process appropriately. I was a junior faculty member who wanted to keep her job. Another pause. Those facts don't constitute an excuse. They constitute an explanation of how I failed a man who trusted me. Edmund Voss was the original inventor of this technology. The patents filed by Iowa State University in 2008, 2009, and 2010 are built on his foundational work. That is a fact I can document and will testify to under oath. The crowd was completely still. I've been carrying this for 18 years, she said. Edmund died carrying it for 30. I think it's time for the weight to go somewhere it belongs. She sat down. In the silence that followed, Vivian Pruitt stood. Using her cane, moving carefully, she turned to face not just Lena, but the crowd, her neighbors, the people she'd lived among for 40 years. I knew Edmund for 30 years, she said. Her voice wavered slightly but did not fail. He fixed our tractor twice without being asked. Brought Harlan metal stock when we were short. Never asked for anything back. We thought he was peculiar. We thought, she paused, and in the pause was 30 years of a small town's casual dismissal. We thought he didn't quite fit. Turns out he didn't fit because he was building something larger than what we could see. She looked at Lena. This woman saw it. I'm grateful she did. She sat down, then others stood. A mechanic who remembered Edmund diagnosing a transmission problem that 3 certified shops had failed to identify. A retired school teacher who recalled him in the public library for hours, always with engineering texts, always polite, always curious, always alone. A farmer from the next county who'd heard about the demonstration and driven 40 minutes because he'd bought fuel cells from one of the university's licensed spin-offs and wanted to understand what he was hearing. The pattern emerged with the clarity of something that had always been true but needed this arrangement of people and moment to become visible. Edmund Voss had been present in Millhaven for 30 years. He had been among them. They had looked at him and seen strange, and strange had been enough to make him invisible. And invisible had made it easy for other people to take what was his. He came forward when the testimony was winding down. She saw the movement at the edge of the crowd, Grail stepping through the gap, moving toward the front with the unhurried deliberateness she'd noticed the night he came to the farm. The crowd parted for him unconsciously, the way crowds part for people who have spent decades expecting space. He reached the area near the workshop entrance, 150 people watching. He looked at the device on its display stand, at the blueprints on the walls, at Lena. And then he did the thing she'd been afraid of, the thing she'd thought about and prepared for and still when it happened, felt the full weight of. He reached for the authority he'd spent a career building. "I appreciate the passion that's been shown here today," he said. His voice was measured collegial, the voice of a reasonable man addressing an emotional situation. Edmund Voss was a dedicated and creative individual. The work before us is impressive, and I want to say publicly that the university is committed to finding appropriate ways to honor his contributions to the field as we move forward. We'd welcome a conversation with Ms. Harwick and her team about a collaborative path. Professor Grail. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. The word collaborative died in the air between them. 150 people were completely silent. She looked at him directly. She had rehearsed nothing for this moment. What came out was simply what was true. Edmund Voss heard that offer once, in 2007, from your institution using your language. They offered to handle his work through the appropriate channels. He trusted that offer. She let that sit for 1 second too. You know what that trust cost him. Burton Grail Professor Emeritus, named chairholder, nationally recognized pioneer in sustainable energy research award recipient grant holder. The man whose career had been built on 30 years of another man's work stood in front of 150 people who had heard everything that had been said in the last 2 hours. He had no answer, not because he couldn't construct one. He was an intelligent man. He could have said something. But the cameras were running, and Nora Aldrich was sitting 20 feet away, and the device was on its stand, and the blueprints were on the walls, and the crowd was watching with the full attention of people who have already decided what the truth is and are waiting to see if anyone will contradict it. He said nothing. He stepped back, turned, walked through the crowd, which parted for him again, but differently this time, not for authority, but to let something leave that had already been seen clearly enough. He got into his car. He drove away. No one watched him go for long. There was too much else to pay attention to. The conference room was neutral ground, a facility in Ames equidistant between Millhaven and the university, the kind of anonymous professional space designed for exactly this kind of meeting, two parties who cannot stand to be in each other's territory attempting to arrive at something functional. The university brought 3 attorneys and a public relations director, and a man named Dr. Marcus Ellsworth, the current department head, who had inherited Grail's programs and Grail's legacy, and who now sat at the table with the expression of someone who has recently understood the full scope of what they've inherited. Lena's side herself, Colt Merritt, Nora and Rosalind Vickers from NIPA via video screen. Outside the windows, the first proper snow of the season was falling. The quiet, purposeful snow that means business covering the parking lot and the highway median and the bare fields visible in the distance with the same patient white. Lena thought about Edmund in his workshop through Iowa winters. The cold that accumulated in concrete-floored spaces, the floor lamp providing the only warmth, the work continuing anyway because the work was what there was. The university's lead counsel, a woman named Victoria Aldred, precise and professionally careful, opened with their position, which was what Merritt had predicted. Acknowledgement of Edmund's preliminary contributions, compensation for Lena's completion, work, a request for confidentiality provisions that would limit further public discussion. Merritt let her finish. Then he slid a folder across the table. Your patents are built on Edmund Voss's foundational invention. You have a cooperating witness who participated in the transfer of his intellectual property to your institution. You have a documented timeline in which his work predates your filings by years. You have a public demonstration attended by regional and national media and recorded in its entirety, including testimony from Dr. Aldrich. He folded his hands. You can fight us through the courts and lose in public over the next several years, or you can settle this today and demonstrate that your institution is capable of doing the right thing when the evidence requires it. Rosalind Vickers added from the screen, the NIPA will file challenges to all 3 patents with or without a settlement. What the settlement determines is whether the university controls how this story concludes or whether we do. The university team requested a private consultation. Lena, Colt, Merritt, Nora, and Rosalind relocated to a smaller room with bad coffee and a window that looked out at the snow. Colt poured 2 cups and handed one to Lena without being asked. How long do we wait? He said. As long as it takes, Merritt said comfortably. He was the most relaxed person in the room, which was either the confidence of a man who knew he had the stronger position or the equanimity of a 72-year-old who had learned to stop spending energy on what he couldn't control? Probably both. They waited. Nora was quiet, looking at the snow. Lena watched her, this woman who had carried the weight of a specific failure for 18 years, who had come here today to help correct it. Who would carry what she'd done to Edmund Voss for the rest of her life, regardless of what this meeting produced? Justice Lena was learning did not erase the past. It only changed what the past was allowed to determine about the future. 2 hours passed. Victoria Aldred knocked on the door and opened it. Her expression had changed, not warmth exactly, but the professional openness of someone who has been authorized to reach an agreement. "We're prepared to discuss resolution," she said. They negotiated for 3 hours. Every word was examined. Every phrase was contested. The university's team pushed back on inventor and proposed pioneering contributor. Merritt pushed back on pioneering contributor and held firm on original inventor. This went on for 40 minutes about a single word, which was how Lena understood that the word mattered more than anything else in the document. They got the word. Edmund Voss, original inventor. The scholarship was agreed to, fully funded, administered through a neutral foundation available to students from rural communities pursuing engineering degrees. The first application cycle would open in spring. No claims on the prototype. No claims on any improvements or commercial developments Lena pursued. All future university publications, research, and patent filings derived from the technology must cite Edmund Voss's foundational contributions. A formal public statement reviewed and approved by both parties before release, acknowledging the university's failure to properly credit Edmund Voss and committing to his recognition going forward. And one additional item added at Lena's request, which Merritt had included without explanation, and which the university's team had accepted after private consultation, Burton Grail would sign a personal acknowledgement separate from the institutional settlement, affirming his knowledge of Edmund Voss's prior development of the technology. Not for public release, not for legal proceedings, simply a document that existed. That said what had happened and named who had done it. A record. Victoria Aldred presented it to him in the hallway outside the conference room at a few minutes past 7 in the evening. Lena didn't watch. She stayed in the conference room with Colt and heard through the closed door the sound of nothing, which was the sound of a man with nothing left to say. He signed it. She heard the door open, heard Merritt's voice, heard the sounds of the meeting concluding, people gathering papers, chairs being pushed back. Colt put his hand on her shoulder. "It's done, Mom." She looked out the window. The snow was still falling. The parking lot was covered now, the cars half buried, the lines between the spaces erased. Everything was the same surface, the same white, nothing marked out as belonging more to one thing than another. Nora found her in the hallway before they left the building. She didn't say much. She had the look of someone who had put something down after carrying it so long that the absence of the weight felt strange. Not relief exactly, but the disorientation of a body adjusting to a new center of gravity. "I submitted my resignation this morning," she said, "before I drove here." Lena looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Nora was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor, then up. "I've been teaching energy systems for 18 years using principles Edmund developed. Every lecture, every paper, every student who graduated thinking those ideas originated in a university laboratory." She stopped, started again. "I couldn't keep doing it. Not after today. Not after saying out loud what I should have said in 2007. She met Lena's eyes. "I'd like to come back to the farm sometime, if that's all right. See the workshop properly. Understand what he actually built without the filter of everything that happened after." "Come whenever you want," Lena said. "The workshop is always open." Nora nodded, pulled on her coat, walked toward the exit doors, into the snow, toward whatever came next for her. Lena watched her go and thought, justice doesn't erase the past. It only changes what the past gets to determine about what comes after. For Edmund, that change had come too late. For Nora, it had come at significant cost. But it had come. That was something. That was not nothing. "Come on," Colt said, appearing beside her with her coat. "Let's go home." The university's statement went out on a Monday morning 10 days later. Lena read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, the way she'd read Edmund's journal that first night, at the same table in the same chair, in the same gray morning light of an Iowa winter. The symmetry of it was not lost on her. Iowa State University acknowledges Edmund Voss as the original inventor of the foundational energy conversion technology developed through independent research in Millhaven, Iowa, beginning in 1994. His name appeared 14 times in the document. The scholarship was announced in the same release, the Edmund Voss Rural Engineering Scholarship, fully endowed first applications to be accepted in March. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it aside and sat for a moment with her coffee going cold. The phone rang throughout the day. Merritt, Rosalind. Henrietta, who was writing a follow-up piece and wanted to quote the National Morning Program again. Vivian, who simply said, "I'm glad, dear. I think he would be glad too," and then let the silence be what it was. Colt made dinner. They ate at the table as the dark came early in the way of December, and afterward they sat with their coffee and didn't talk for a while, which was its own kind of communication. "What happens now?" Colt asked. She'd been thinking about this, had been thinking about it since the night in the workshop when the device had first hummed to life, and she'd understood that what Edmund had left behind was not just an unfinished machine, but an incomplete argument, a claim on the world that needed a voice. "This workshop stays open," she said. "We make it a place where people can come and understand what he built, what it took to build it." She looked at her coffee. Students, teachers, people who are building their own things in their own workshops and need to know that it's possible. Colt was quiet, turning something over. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the licensing agreements. Merritt says several manufacturers have already reached out about production rights. Commercial production of Edmund's device for rural communities, for the agricultural sector, for the specific populations Edmund had designed it to serve. The licensing fees would be real money, money that needed somewhere to go. We could build a foundation, something that protects independent inventors. Legal resources, documentation support the things Edmund didn't have when he needed them." She looked at her son. "He would have loved that," she said. "It was your idea, actually. You just hadn't said it out loud yet." She smiled. He was right. The Memorial Laboratory dedication was held in March on a campus that was beginning its slow return to green after a long winter. Lena and Colt drove up together, arriving in a morning that was cold but not brutal, the kind of March morning that was promising something without quite delivering it yet. The Edmund Voss Memorial Energy Innovation Laboratory was in the engineering building, dedicated with a bronze plaque beside the entrance that bore his photograph, the same photograph she'd found in the kitchen drawer that first morning, the precise eyes and the slight smile and the quality of someone who knew something the camera didn't. The university president spoke. The words were careful and institutional, acknowledging an unfortunate failure in how Mr. Voss's contributions were credited and praising his innovative spirit and dedication to practical solutions. It was the language of an institution that had been required to tell the truth and was doing so in the most controlled way available to it. She had expected to be angry at the language. She found she wasn't. The plaque said what the plaque said. The scholarship said what the scholarship said. The legal documents said what they said in plain and unambiguous terms, and those documents existed and would continue to exist long after everyone in this room was gone. The first scholarship recipient was announced that morning. Ren Kowalski, 19 years old, from a farming community in Harlan County. She had taught herself advanced mathematics from library books and online tutorials, had been working in her family's equipment or repair shop since she was 12, and had been accepted to the engineering program on a merit basis but couldn't afford the tuition. She shook Lena's hand with the firm grip of someone who worked with their hands, looked her in the eye and said, "Thank you for fighting for him. People like us, we need to know that someone who started where we started can do something that lasts." Lena held that sentence the way you hold something you know you'll return to. It was what Edmund had believed, had worked toward, had staked 30 years on, that the work mattered regardless of credentials, that the truth of a thing didn't require institutional blessing to be true, that rural genius existed and deserved recognition and could, given the right circumstances, change things. Ren Kowalski would be the first. There would be others. April arrived at the farm with a warmth that felt earned. She stood in the workshop doorway on a morning of new sun, watching green push through the brown fields, the land doing what land does when winter finally releases, it returning to itself, becoming again what it had always been capable of being. The workshop behind her was clean and organized and lit. The device stood on its display stand, where it had stood since the demonstration, connected now to the farmhouse's main electrical panel, powering the house with the clean, quiet efficiency Edmund had designed it for. The lights in the kitchen ran on it. The heat ran on it. Every morning when Lena made her coffee, the coffee was made with Edmund's invention, and she had stopped being able to separate that fact from the simple domestic comfort of the act. She opened the journal. Not to read, she'd read it enough that she could locate any entry from memory. She opened it to the blank pages near the end where she'd been adding her own entries since November. The record she'd been keeping, not just of the case and its resolution, but of what the case had taught her, about loneliness and its purposes, about work that no one sees and why it matters to do it anyway, about what it means to be invisible for so long that when someone finally looks at you clearly, it takes a moment to understand that you are being seen. She found a fresh page. April 14th, she wrote, 7 months since the fair. Edmund's name is on a laboratory on a scholarship in legal documents that will outlast everyone involved in making them. The device is running. The foundation is being built. Ren Kowalski starts in the fall. She paused, looked out the workshop door at the fields. I came here with nothing. No job, no plan, no understanding of what I was walking into. What I walked into was a life someone else's carefully built, prematurely ended. And in honoring it, I seem to have found my way back to my own. She wrote one more line. Edmund, we did it. Your name will be remembered. Not as a footnote as the original, as the beginning of the thing. That's what you were. That's what you always were. She closed the journal. She heard Colt's car on the gravel. He had gone into Mill Haven for groceries that morning. The ordinary errand of someone who had made ordinary plans here, who had relocated his remote work to a farmhouse in Iowa and was finding apparently that this suited him in ways the Boston apartment had stopped doing. He'd mentioned over dinner last week that he'd been talking to Merritt about the foundation's technology infrastructure needs. He'd mentioned it casually, the way you mention something you've already decided. She heard his door, his footsteps on the porch, his voice calling through the house. Mom, I'm back. Arlo says hi. She smiled at that. Arlo had been in the front row at the demonstration, had stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and had never once mentioned what she'd seen on his face when the device powered on. He'd promoted her to assistant manager the week after the settlements and said simply, "You're good for the business. People trust you." From Arlo, that was a speech she'd accepted without making him elaborate. In the workshop, she called back. She looked at the device, at the copper coils, at the blueprints on the walls, Edmund's careful handwriting in the margins, the accumulated evidence of a mind that had believed in something for 30 years and had been right. She looked at the photograph she'd mounted on the wall beside the door, the original carefully framed, now the photograph from the kitchen drawer. Edmund Voss in his workshop, one hand resting on the device, that slight smile suggesting something the camera couldn't access. The same smile she'd looked at that first night, not yet knowing what she was looking at. She knew now. It was the smile of someone who was certain, who had done the work and understood the work and knew with the specific confidence of a person who has spent 30 years getting something right, that what they'd built was real, that the mathematics were sound, that the principles were solid, that it would work eventually for someone, even if that someone wasn't them. Someone who believes enough, he'd written. Colt appeared in the workshop doorway with a grocery bag and his father's jawline and his mother's stubbornness squinting into the morning light that was coming through behind her. The device is running, he said, not a question. He could hear it, that low, steady hum that had become the soundtrack of the farm, the background note against which everything else happened now. It's always running, she said. He came and stood beside her, and they looked at together the thing Edmund Voss had built alone in this room across 30 years of certainty that nobody shared, the thing that had waited in the dark of a locked workshop for someone to believe it was real. Outside, the Iowa spring continued its patient return. The fields went green, the crows argued in the tree line. The gravel driveway held the warmth of the morning sun, and somewhere down rural Route 9, 2 miles toward town, Vivian and Pruitt's farmhouse stood in the same light it had always stood in, and the world was the same world it had always been, and yet something in it had shifted permanently, the way things shift when a true thing is finally said out loud and cannot be unsaid. Edmund Voss had built something real. Lena Harwick had believed it was real. And in the space between those two facts, separated by 30 years and a $5 raffle ticket in a dead man's careful handwriting, in an accountant who had learned to read blueprints by lamplight in an Iowa barn. In that space, something that had been taken was being returned. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in time for the man who deserved it most, but returned. In the workshop on Rural Route 9, the device hummed its steady note, powering the lights, powering the heat, doing exactly and precisely what it had always been designed to do. Proof that the work had been real. Proof that it had always been real. Proof that some things wait patient and certain for the person who will finally believe them into the light.